The next project that you're going to do is going to be based off the idea of linear perspective or the illusion of space. Linear perspective is considered a mathematical uh, invention of the Renaissance, where artists came up with a set of rules that could help them realistically create the three-dimensional world in a flat two-dimensional plane. Now, they didn't come to linear perspective immediately, so we'll see there's some things that they realized just from observing the outside world that would help them to create realistic space within their works of art. The first thing that artists realized was that they could create space through the picture plane and overlapping. So if you look at this painting on the right, we see some space happening, right? Um, and what you're seeing is typical of this pre-Renaissance period. You see the painting itself sort of looks somewhat like a window. This was often what artists thought about when they thought about depicting the world, that the painting could be a window. Also, as we mentioned before, the window becomes very relevant in how they figured out how to create linear perspective. The second thing you'll notice is that there's very large central figure. Now, typically when we see a painting, we think that the largest figure is closest to us. Do you think that's true in this painting? No, right? The figures that look closest to us are either those little men down at the bottom, right? And they look closest to us because there's one general rule that typically things that are lower on the picture plane appear closer to us. Now, if I were standing up in front of the class, or if you're looking out into your room, that's actually true in how we see our visual plane. Typically, things that are closer to us are actually lower within our visual field. So artists very quickly realized if you put things lower in the picture plane, they'll appear closer. The second rule is what's called overlap. So if you look at the little angels along the side, all the little angels are the same size, but the one that is lowest appears closest to us because essentially one is overlapped in front of each other. I can see all of the front angel, but the parts of the angels behind them are blocked. Now, this might seem like common sense to you now, but this was actually a breakthrough during the time of the Renaissance. They realized through stacking things that they could create depth. Now, if you wonder why the central figure is the largest, at this point, oftentimes size um, meant importance. So obviously the central figure here, the Madonna, was the most important part of this picture, not necessarily the closest to you, but she was biggest because she was the most important. The second thing that artists realized was something called diminution and intuitive perspective. So this artist is still using the illusion of overlap. So the things that are closest to us are in front of the landscape behind us. You'll also notice that he's using picture planes, so those front figures are lower on the picture plane and also closest to us. But this artist also used something known as diminution. So as things get further away, they get smaller and smaller as they go into the distance. And this is something that you can naturally see, right? If I've got something sitting right in front of me, like a big chair, it's going to be larger in my visual field, where something far away that's very large, like a tree, can actually be smaller. And you can see the artist is utilizing that diminution in this piece. He's got that tiny little tree that would normally be much taller than a horse um, in the background there, and the horse is very large in the foreground. Now, there's aspects of this piece that don't look quite right, right? If you look at those little buildings on the top left, they look kind of wonky. Same with the church. It almost looks like it's going to fall off of the hill. He knew that things got smaller, but they're all not getting smaller at the same rate. The same thing, sort of the sides of the houses, right? Or the sides of the buildings almost seem like they're going to kind of topple over or wobble off of that mountain. That's because artists hadn't quite figured out those rules of perspective yet. The next thing the artists figured out is something called aerial perspective. And in aerial perspective, sometimes called atmospheric perspective, artists realize that as things get further in the distance, they become less detailed, less contrast. Now, this is something that we can see here in the Bay Area, often on those smoky days. Um, the foothills, the Hayward foothills, might seem sort of blurry, um, where you see no distance at all. Other days, when it's clearer out or there's less atmosphere, you might be able to see all the little trees and bushes at a distance. The atmosphere is getting in your way of seeing the detail, right? So artists realize that very early on, and the further things get away, the more the atmosphere gets in the distance. It also has to do with just how we see, right? Things that are close to us, we can see in more detail, more contrast. Things that are further away, our eyes can't pick up on that light as easily, and we see less detail. You can see this is famous Mona Lisa, and one of the first times that atmospheric perspective is used, you can see it there in the background. We've got the very large foreground figure, but if you look at the background, you can see those roads and details sort of hazing out to that atmospheric haze all the way up behind the head. Now, that was a painted example. During our perspective drawing, we're going to be using line. You can kind of think of it in a similar way. We have more detailed object to the front, less detail, smaller, finer lines sort of going back into the distance. So that's something we'll talk about as we get towards the finished part of our linear perspective piece, how you can add that aspect of aerial or atmospheric perspective to your finished work. So the next thing artists discovered is something called linear perspective. And linear perspective is a mathematical system for creating an illusion of space um, on a flat two-dimensional surface. It began very suddenly. This is one of the first pieces that was noted to have linear perspective involved. And if you notice, those lines in the ceiling, you can see right there above Christ, they're not just going straight back, because those ceiling lines, typically we know that they're parallel lines, meaning they should never touch, right? If they went into infinity, they're never going to touch. But when we look at them in linear perspective, they're eventually going to vanish back and come together at what is known as a vanishing point. So parallel lines sort of get infinitely and infinitely closer to a converging point. There are some very famous examples of this, like Da Vinci's Last Supper, where he used the vanishing points as part of his conceptual meaning. If you notice, if you follow back all of those converging lines, they disappear back to one vanishing point. And that's actually what we're going to talk about, one point perspective, right there behind also the head of Christ there in the middle. So you'll see that often artists use the vanishing points to imply importance. Okay, so the first step in understanding linear perspective has to do with what's known as the eye level or horizon line. Oftentimes, people will refer to this as the horizon line. Eye level is a more accurate way to think about it, because if we're somewhere where there's a big mountain or something going on in the background, the horizon line could be very high up, and uh, it wouldn't be accurate for perspective. The horizon line is actually the theoretical line. If I'm wherever I'm sitting or standing and I look straight out I have the laser beams of my eyes heading straight out in front of me. That is my eye level. Um, and if you kind of see, if you see the guy there on the left, that eye level, it's going to determine where my lines are vanishing to. So if something is above my eye level, I could see the bottom of the box, right? But I don't see the top. If something is on my eye level, I don't see the top or bottom of the box. If something is below my eye level, I see the tops of the box. This will come in handy as we start to use some boxes in still lifes, because you'll be able to sort of pinpoint where exactly your eye level or horizon line is. So another important part of perspective is what's called vanishing points. And now vanishing points are based on that principle of convergence, where lines that are parallel, if we were sort of looking at them in a mathematical way, will actually converge as they go into the distance in linear perspective. So they're going to appear to come completely together at some point. So this is something that you're going to be able to go out and observe. This is an observable thing that happens. Like if I was to stand outside in the middle of railroad tracks, don't do that for your project. But you could imagine that in the distance, it's going to appear like those railroad tracks are converging to one point, and that is what is called the vanishing point. Um, we can kind of think about these theoretically, which we're going to do today, drawing some boxes. You can also think about these where you will actually be able to go out and visually find where that vanishing point is. So there are different types of linear perspective. We're going to look at each one. There's 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. So as you can imagine, it all depends on how many vanishing points there are in your scenario, right, in your scene. The first one that we're going to look at is what's known as 1-point perspective. So this is the most simplistic one of the vanishing points. It's where you will find that all converging lines in your piece go back to one singular point. Now, in 1-point perspective, it means that if you're looking at a box, the flat end of that box is facing you. So you're looking at the flat end of a box. Now, it doesn't mean that your vanishing point is always going to be in the middle. That's why we have our viewfinders, right? If I take my viewfinder and I change my composition around, that vanishing point could actually be anywhere in my composition. What depends on where your horizon line is, and your vanishing point is sort of where you're sitting at or where you've cropped that composition to. So you can actually see a good example of where on the right here, where the vanishing point and eye level is actually quite high in the upper right, because the artist chose to include more of that lower foreground, but each part of the box is facing them. So common scenarios where you'll see 1-point perspective. Now, part of what you have to do this week is you're going to go out and you're going to make thumbnails of examples of each type of this perspective. So you're going to go out and find at least one example of 1-point perspective. Common examples of this you can find actually very easily on your street, or in a large public setting. If you are on Chabot campus, there's a lot of examples of these 1-point perspectives. There's a good example of this piece. Can you figure out where the horizon line and the vanishing point would be? So if I follow all those converging lines back into the piece, you'll see the horizon line is right there where my back line goes behind the buildings, and my vanishing point is smack in the middle of that center building in between those two little figures in the dark doorway. Like I said, you're going to go out and you're going to try to find examples of this. And the really interesting thing, there's some really great examples of this if you just are on your street and you go out in front of your house, our roads are almost set up perfectly like this. And anything that's going along the side of that road, so buildings, doorways, um, telephone lines, are all going to disappear back to that same vanishing point as long as they're sort of situated along that same roadway. Another really good example of this is indoors. So if we were at school, we could easily go in and use the hallway. This is always my great 1-point example because my horizon line, sort of the back line of the door there, and my vanishing point is smack in the middle of that doorway. So all the lines of the lockers, even the little venting lines, even the lines of the lights, the tile work in the ceiling, all go back to that one vanishing point smack in the middle of the hallway. And if you're looking for an area in your house, actually a hallway in your house works just as well for this. So you can kind of think about interiors too, especially with everything that's going on right now. That might be a consideration. You can find a nice area in your house that you can situate yourself. Like I said, there's all kinds of ways that you can think about this. And the beauty of this is that as long as everything's situated along that same plane, it will all disappear back to that one vanishing point. If you have objects that are sort of irregular, right, it's very easy to see the vanishing point with the lines of the bricks or the lights. But if you have an irregular object like the chairs in this example, those chairs are actually getting smaller along the same proportions. So even if it's as it's moving down in space, you could still follow that line back to help give you the height and the width of that chair. So the next type of perspective is what's called two-point perspective. And two-point perspective is found when you see an edge of a square or a building closest to you. So instead of the flat front of a square or a rectangle facing you, an edge is closest to you. So that's the biggest difference. You'll see this whenever you have an edge being closest to you instead of a flat front facing you. So as you can imagine, in two-point perspective, there are two vanishing points. The difficult part about seeing this outside is oftentimes those vanishing points might be outside of your composition, and that's totally okay. When we get to our larger piece, I'll give you some strategies that can help you find that out. If you're doing a thumbnail, go ahead and make your vanishing points outside of your thumbnail. You're going to want to go ahead and find them, but they can be outside of what's considered in your composition. So in two-point perspective, all of the horizontal lines will be disappearing back to either a left or right vanishing point. And all the vertical lines are going to remain parallel through infinity. They don't converge in any way in two-point perspective. So the horizontal lines converge, vertical lines don't. So this is another one that you will be able to easily find out there. Even if you're just going outside of your own house, you can sit there and look at the corner of the house and be able to see all of those lines converging. And every line converged, the windows, the siding, smaller details, everything will converge back to those 2 points. The last type of perspective is something called three-point perspective. You don't have to use an example for this because you have to be somewhere with an extreme height. So if you went to downtown San Francisco, for example, and looked at some tall buildings there, you would see three-point perspective in action. Or if you were up high looking at something down below, that's also where you'd see three-point perspective in action. And the idea is that, so you still have your two vanishing points, right? You still have your left and your right side vanishing back where the horizontal lines are converging. In three-point perspective, the vertical lines are also converging because they're getting smaller as you go up, right? Or in a bird's eye view, um, they're getting smaller as they go back into space. Now, artists, once you've mastered this 1 point and 2 point and 3 point perspective, you can use them to create any space that you want. M.C. Escher was sort of the master of linear perspective and creating illusionistic spaces, sometimes even warping the space to his to create imaginary spaces, or other times creating this sort of warped reality. Um, and the idea is if you understand the rules, you can know how to break them and you become more creative. So through this process, you're actually going to be able to more easily draw whatever your heart desires. Because once you understand perspective, you can realistically create um, uh, three-dimensional space on a flat two-dimensional page. That's sort of what M.C. Escher is playing off in this piece. Like I said, the final outcome of this piece is you are going to do a line drawing finished in your Micron pen or Sharpie that you're going to turn in for a final grade. You're going to have some steps along the way to help you get to that final point. Normally we do this on campus in person, but you guys are going to be finding spots around your house or neighborhood to draw. So for this assignment post, you are going to be turning in 4 thumbnail sketches. They must be done from in person, so not from photographs or anything that you find online. You're going to try to find spots around your house or neighborhood, hopefully if things clear up here. You're going to use your viewfinder to help you create an interesting composition. So you don't have to include everything that you see in front of you. You can kind of hone in on what you think is going to create an interesting use of your compositional page. One of your thumbnails must be in 1 point perspective. One must be in 2 point perspective. The other 2 thumbnails you can use whatever kind of perspective that you want, but they have to be in some kind of perspective. Make sure that you find your horizon line, so that's your first step. And the second step is finding your vanishing points or points. They may be off the page. All right, so you're going to turn those in, and then next week we'll get started on the longer project.